So, hello, Juliet Fortino.
Hi,
How are you this evening?
I'm great. How are you?
That's good. I'm doing fine. I'm surviving COVID so far, so we're good to go.
That is the best news ever when you can survive it, right?
Right. This used to be like the room I used for special stuff like interviews, and now it's just where I spend all day every day.
I was talking to a friend earlier and I'm like, okay, I need to change the scenery. I need out of my office and into the kitchen.
Yeah, right. Step on the back patio for a minute, right?
Exactly. Let me go get the mail.
Yeah, just a trip out to the mailbox. So Juliet, I know you through really a friend of my sister's, but someone I've known for a long time. And you are you a therapist? Is that the right word?
That
Okay.
is the right word.
And a child therapist, right? Is that
Specialize in children.
okay? All right. So some of the stuff we talked about a little bit was just how you help kids deal with life or deal with traumas. And it's different. Like with an adult, you picture a therapist, you get together and you have 20 sessions because you have to talk through the minute your first memory until now before you figure anything out, right?
Right? I
but
go through
but
childhood.
yeah, right. Um, but kids may not respond to they not necessarily want to sit around and talk. So I guess that's where you come in. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and maybe I'll come up with some questions as we go. But tell me about what you do, how you work with kids, and how you help them work through what's going on in their lives.
Yeah, so I am technically a child and family therapist. That's kind of what I call myself. So I'm licensed within my state to practice any kind of therapy, any kind of counseling that I choose, the type of credential that I have. But I knew early on in my career that I wanted to work with children. And so that's what I do. I do therapy with little kids. And because of that, I've chosen to use play as a way to do therapy. And so I actually am a credentialed play therapist. There is such a thing as a credential in play therapy. And so I get little letters after my name that say I'm a registered play therapist and a supervisor, so that I supervise others wanting to become play therapists. And so what you and I would do, the easiest way for me to describe it is that what you and I would do with our words, where we sit and we have a dialogue about this is why I'm sad today, or this is what happened in my life. Kids don't have all the abilities to do that. And so play is a way for kids to process through their life experiences, process through their trauma. I do a lot of trauma work, and tell me their story without having to use words. That's the simplistic answer.
So what age groups do you work with? So I think you said little kids, but what does that mean?
Um, so I actually just got a request to see a 2.5 year old.
Oh, wow.
And that's really young. I will do it. I'm comfortable with that population. Not a lot of people are. Um, but my preference would always be to do that in a family scenario where I have some caregivers or some relatives or whatever their story is, to try to do much more of that work. But three is a pretty young age. I've taken lots of 3 year olds in because that's the type of work that I do. And I will see kids all the way up through. I see adults. I don't particularly love working with adults. But if I do work with adults, it's usually in my playroom, and I do expressive arts. I do sand tray work. I'm a play therapist at heart. And so if you want to come to therapy with me, you're going to play.
Honestly, depending on the personality or maybe even the mood you're in, that might fit you better at a given time, right?
Well, and if you think about it, I mean, the majority of us as adults, we get stuck in our heads. We can talk ourselves in and out of things. We can therapize ourselves. I can therapize myself till I'm blue in the face. But when you get into the playroom and you start doing some of the more, and I don't mean just playing with dolls, but some of the more expressive types of play media that we can access, it takes you completely out of your head and into a much more subconscious place. And so a lot more work happens when you can get out of your head.
Yeah, yeah. Is therapize a word? That's a new one. I haven't heard that.
I don't know, but I just made it up. So I can therapize myself really well.
I thought maybe it was an official term that I wasn't aware of.
I think
Okay,
it's an official term that us therapists use.
there you go. The
Thereabouts.
therapist lingo there.
There you go.
So how you said you work with a lot of 3-year-olds. I mean, what are some, I guess the first question is, what are some reasons a 3-year-old would come to you? I mean, you it's tough. It's tough to imagine that, because I picture my kids as
Right.
3 years old, and we're just trying to get them to figure out how to deal with the fact that things are disappointing, or they can't have McDonald's tonight, stuff like that.
So, as I said, I do a lot of trauma work. And so that means that if I get a request for services, generally speaking, that child has experienced some pretty rough times. The majority of my caseload, the work that I choose to do, are children in foster care. And so those kids have experienced pretty significant life traumas, abusive homes, drug situation homes. So unfortunately, those things happen. I think the majority of us live in a world where we don't want to acknowledge that children are hurt,
Yeah.
but they are. And so from early in my career, just fell in love with that work, being able to work with really little ones that don't have verbal expression, but still need to talk, still need to work through their stuff. And so, yeah, 3 is, I've done a lot of under 5, I guess is the way I should say that. And it's all trauma work when I get them that young.
So can I ask, how do you help a child that young who and they're raised in a traumatic situation, so all they probably know at that age is trauma, right? I mean,
Right.
and it's a horrible comparison, but you think of rescuing animals, and people, you take in an animal that's been abused its whole life, and it's scared of people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I mean, we're animals, right? In a sense. So what do you do with a under 5-year-old who doesn't know how to communicate anything, and doesn't even know that the things they've been through are even different than somebody else, let alone probably wrong? How do
Right.
you work with that?
Play. That's my short answer. So the idea behind play therapy is that there are, I could get super technical, but I won't, but there are lots of factors that kind of drive how play works for children. And so as a play therapist, what I've done is studied for the last almost 25 years the brain, and understanding brain development, and understanding how trauma impacts children's brains. And then using that information um, and the factors of what we know to be true about play, just play in general, to do therapy. And so I provide, I have a very large playroom. I'm very fortunate in where I am in my career, but I have a very large playroom where kids will do the work that they need to do. And so I give them tools. And when I say tools, I mean toys. And they automatically, it's inherent in them to play out what they know. So your child at home will frequently play house, will play with dolls, and they will reenact the things that they've seen and observed, the things that they know to be true for their world. So in a generally speaking, in a normal household, little girls will play mommies, and they have baby dolls, and they rock them, and they snuggle them, and they put them to bed, and they feed them. That's play therapy. That's a reenactment of the world that they know. And so when you give the child who has a trauma history those tools, they are going to reenact what they know. It's a term called abreaction, and it's considered one of the therapeutic powers of play, which is, there are 20 of them. So abreaction is this idea that we recreate our story, we recreate our trauma, we recreate our experiences. And so the child who gets dolls and plays house, and snuggles their baby and puts them to bed and feeds them and does all these things, they are telling you their story of their life because that's what they've observed, that's what they've witnessed, that's what they've experienced. For a child who doesn't have that environment, who lives in a chaotic environment or a traumatic environment or an abusive environment, their play is going to reflect that same story. And so rather than the baby that, or the little child that, holds the baby and snuggles the baby and rocks the baby, you might see a child who physically hits the baby. You might see a child who puts the baby night-night and puts the pillow over their face, right? And so their story is that part of, it may not be that they were smothered by a pillow, but in some way they felt smothered.
Yeah.
Does that make a little bit of sense there?
Yeah. Well, then what do you do to help them work through that? Or is it just a matter of bringing it out and then letting their foster parents know, hey, here's something they may have dealt with, or where do you go from there?
Oh, so many places to go. A lot of it depends on their age. A lot of it depends on the theoretical approach of the therapist working with the child. But in essence, they will do that work on their own. The more they play it out, the more they reenact it, the more they process it. So what you and I would do with our words, we would continue to talk about it and talk about how we feel about it. They're doing in their play. And so we move towards mastery of it. And so when I say that, you and I process with our words and we talk about it until finally we don't feel so overwhelmed by those emotions. The same is true for play. We process through the play, and we gain a sense of mastery, or this idea that we don't feel so overwhelmed by those emotions. So I'm super simplifying, 25 years worth of studying this field, but they're able to just kind of process through, even without their words. Ideally, there's a family scenario that is helping this process. So I work a lot with foster parents and a lot of adoptive parents. And so not only am I working with that child individually, but then I'm also working with those parents to provide the structure and the consistency and the resources that this child needs to help continue that process.
That makes sense. So they come with you and they're playing, and you can get sort of a window into their soul in a way, I guess, and maybe understand something of what's going on with them. But hopefully when they go home with their foster parents, they're in a healthy, I was gonna say normal, but a healthy situation.
Hopefully. Mm-hmm.
And so, so then you hope that, I guess, even at that young age, they can see this makes me feel good and that made me feel bad, even, like that. Is that a kind of it?
Absolutely. And it's teaching foster parents, not to, and this is a hard concept to grasp, but teaching foster parents that it's not about the behavior. A child's behavior, which is typically how we know children are having problems, is they have behaviors. And so a child's behavior is one small portion of their world. And so helping foster parents, relatives, whoever has placement of the child to understand that it's a behavior, it's a symptom of whatever it is that they've experienced. And so how do we as parents change our parenting approach so that we don't focus on the behavior, but we focus on that bigger picture of this is a hurt child, and what do we need to provide this hurt child to help them move through this? And I do a lot of trauma work, but the same is all true for your child. If your child was experiencing anxiety because school is overwhelming and they have a lot of pressure on them, or whatever their story is, it's all the same. It's just the underlying factors that come into play are different for each child, but the premise of working with them is still the same. And I would still work with you as a parent and help you understand your child's anxiety and the pressures that they're feeling from school, and how to parent that, how to not focus on the behavior, but focus on the bigger picture of where this child is and how they're feeling.
That makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. So do you find that, I'm guessing I don't know the right words to use here. I mean, I want to say it's more successful for a younger child because they maybe aren't as ingrained in it, but I don't know if success is even the right word, but is it is it more successful for a younger child, or what is the proper way to say that?
We always look at progress, and any type of progress is success. Um, it's there's not an answer to your question. It's always better when we get them younger. That's absolutely a true statement. We can affect more change when we get them earlier, but that doesn't mean that if I get a 10-year-old who's had 10 years worth of a chaotic lifestyle, that doesn't mean that I still can't make that progress and still have success. Success is going to look different for each kid. Success is going to look different for each family. Um, so for me as a therapist, it's for me as a play therapist, it's defining the goal. What do you want this goal to be? And a lot of times, because I work within the child welfare system, within our CPS system, it's fix my kid, right? Like it's make this behavior stop. And so for me, sometimes success is getting the people around this child to understand that there's nothing wrong with the child. They are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing because of everything that they've experienced. They're acting the way they're supposed to act. You would act this way too if you had these horrible things happen to you. And so sometimes that's the way I define success, is getting the people around the child to understand that there's nothing wrong with the child. We just need to support the child in a different way than the norm, than the expected outcomes.
Right. And I think it takes a special person to be a foster parent in the first place. So is that your biggest hurdle then, is helping? So in my family, in my family, where we raise the kids up and we talk to them about their feelings, and you know, we try to be again, I don't know the lingo, I don't know the words, but
Okay, say it. I got it all.
we try to be open to them as human beings and help them understand who they are, what motivates them, what to avoid, etc.
We raise them to be decent human beings, hopefully.
Yeah, to raise them to be productive, quality human beings, to treat other human beings and other living beings, with respect, right?
Yep.
Is your biggest hurdle to help those families, like, I guess, combine, or you take a child that doesn't really understand that that's a thing, and you put them in a place that is a thing, and then all of a sudden there's this conflict where the foster parents only want good things to happen,
Mhm.
but the child maybe doesn't even understand that is what's happening because they've never seen that. Is that the biggest struggle, or?
Is that my biggest struggle? That's a really good question. I think that is probably in the top three of the struggles that I face working within the child welfare system. Is helping those around the child to understand the child and understand the behaviors. And I do a lot of so a lot of the way I approach working with play therapy is from a neurobiological perspective. Um, and so helping people understand that this kiddo's brain doesn't work the way yours does. And so we have to rethink things. I would honestly say my biggest struggle, again, my own personal struggle, is the system itself. And it's not, how do I say this politically correct? It's not designed to always take the child's best interests into heart. And so I frequently will put myself in a position to advocate for the child because I don't feel like anybody else is. And so when I say that, what I mean is there's lots of moving pieces to a child who is in a foster care system. There's case managers from various agencies, and there's the court systems, and there's the attorneys, and then there's the attorneys for parents and parental rights, and there's all sorts of moving parts. And sometimes those moving parts don't take into consideration the child's well-being. And so sometimes that's my biggest struggle or hurdle, is the system, and trying to affect change in the system so that the kiddo that I'm working with gets everything that they need and deserve.
I've seen that. If anybody watches my podcast, I talked to somebody who works in the foster care system in Peoria, Illinois, and she talked about the same things. Just the hurdles of getting through it, and caseworkers and switching caseworkers, and I said to her, well, it's probably good to have the right caseworker who knows how to deal in court, because most of us have no idea how to walk into a courtroom. But somebody that does it every day of the week knows the system, or the game, I guess would be. And the good part and the bad part is that the birth parents get so much
Yep.
leeway, I guess, and that's not the right word either. But the birth parents have so much opportunity to right the ship, and I think in a lot of cases, objectively and subjectively, we look from the outside and say it's never going to happen. But if you don't do it for one parent, as being in the law, you can't do it for any, and that's the challenge. Is that?
And I think that, and this is my own soapbox, so take that for what it's worth. The system does a disservice, at least here in Arizona, where I am, does a disservice to our children because of parental rights. And we often continue to give parents efforts and efforts and efforts and efforts when they're not really making a lot of efforts. And the children in foster care are the ones suffering, because now we've been in foster care for 3 years and there's no permanency, and caseworkers have changed and behavioral health systems have changed and all sorts of stuff have happened. I mean, I can't tell you the number of cases that I have worked in my career that I am the longest standing person in the child's life. And I'm a therapist, right? Like, I'm not a parent, I'm a therapist. I see this child 1 hour a week, and I'm the longest relationship that they have, because they've had multiple foster homes, because they've had multiple DCS, CPS case managers. They've had multiple behavioral health case managers. And so I could soapbox this one.
I know. And where's the balance, right? It's so hard to strike
Mm-hmm.
a balance, and you have to have guidelines around it. It's just that you see so many cases where, like you said, the child just gets lost in the mess, right?
Yeah. So that's why I say that my biggest hurdle is fighting that this child is not going to get lost in the shuffle, and that they will have a family. I'm determined that they will have a family that will love them and support them and take care of them the way they deserve to be taken care of.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Of course.
So you've got to have times where this is really difficult, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you come home and you've seen maybe horrific things, or understood horrific things about a child. Where do your lines get drawn, and how do you deal with that on a personal basis?
Yeah, it's funny. I get asked that a lot. As a play therapist supervisor, I do a lot of training. I teach others in the field how to do this work and how to do it from a play therapy perspective. And I get asked that question a lot when I teach, because this is it's a high burnout profession. Dealing with people's emotions day in and day out it's a high burnout profession, let alone adding in when you're talking about childhood trauma and all of the horrors and the details that you can encounter. And I never know how to answer it, because it does take a lot of effort to find those boundaries for yourself, and not take it home. I know early in my career, I would come home and I'd be talking about my day, and and I heard about this, and this kid did that, and my husband finally said, okay, I can't hear this, right? Like, again, the average American doesn't want to know that children are hurt, and how badly they can be hurt by stupid people, right? So it's learning how to balance that. And so for me, it was finding resources. He wasn't telling me that I couldn't talk about my day, but he didn't want to know my stuff, my details.
Yeah.
Didn't want to know that horror that I heard. And so finding, I had really good supervision, first of all. So I had a supervisor who would listen to me day or night, no matter what I was dealing with, and supported me 100%. But finding my colleagues, finding other play therapists that I work with in the community, I work with it within the state, as well as nationwide. I mean, there's a play therapist everywhere you turn these days, no matter what city or state you live in. And so I started going to some of the national conferences, and I would meet other people and made connections for myself, made networks for myself. And to this day, I could still call any one of them and say, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? And how am I working through this? And I need somebody to talk me off the ledge. And so that's how I kind of set it for myself professionally. But then also personally, I do self-care like nobody's business.
What does that mean?
That means I take time off.
Okay.
That means when I know that I'm feeling drained, I'm feeling emotionally drained and emotionally like, okay, I need to recharge my batteries, I just take time off. And if we're fortunate that we get to travel, when we get to travel, we travel. And so I go places and I do things and I find things to do that has nothing whatsoever to do with the job. And of course, being the play therapist, whenever I travel, I'm always finding new toys that I have to bring home. It's an addiction. And I get massages and I get, I do my best to take care of myself. I exercise regularly. I go every morning, no matter what. I go for a walk. I just try to do those things that recharge my batteries, because it is a draining job.
How long did it take you to learn how to to do that, to take care of yourself? I mean, you've been doing this for 25 years. I wouldn't imagine that's an overnight thing, learning how to deal with that kind of thing.
I think I think I'm still in that process.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there are still moments where I say, okay, why am I feeling this way? Why am I not sleeping? Why am I, and those are the moments where I have to stop and say, okay, I know exactly why I'm not sleeping. I know exactly why. And so I have to just take that break and recognize that it's on me and it's time to do that. It's a lot of insight. I don't know that I've mastered it. I think it's a learning process all the time.
I have some technical questions for you. I thought of them a little while. So you talked about the kids' brains and how they form when they're young, based on your experiences. So this is gonna be completely non-technical by me. So this is a
Go
layperson.
ahead.
So I had seen this TED talk where this guy did like a study of brains and like 3D images of brains, and based on people's experiences, you could see like this part of it was empty and there's the 3D model around it. And I mean, I don't know you're doing brain scans on these kids, but is that kind of thinking in there where you're like,
Yep.
I have an idea of where this kid is missing the ability to cope with this because this part of the brain isn't developed, so let's work on developing that part of it? Does that come into play?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I typically try when I do play therapy to do a lot of it from a neurobiological perspective. And so I've done a lot of coursework, a lot of extra study into understanding trauma in the brain. And there's some really great resources out there for those of us that are really fascinated by this stuff. So when you were talking, a couple of people came into my head. There's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Daniel Amen, Amen. He does a lot of that kind of study where he looks at, and not just children with trauma, but just people across the board. When you have a brain that is on drugs, and a specific drug, and then you have a brain that is 3 months post recovery, and
Yeah.
the different areas that get lit up when you take those, I forget what his are called, PET scans. And then there's a gentleman out of the Child Trauma Academy in Houston by the name of Bruce Perry, who does amazing functional MRI imaging for children who've experienced trauma and the changes in the brain that are documented by these MRIs. There's also a gentleman, Bruce Perry is an MD and a PhD. And then there's a gentleman by the name of Dan Siegel, who is also an MD and a PhD, who I mean, they're all brilliant, but brilliant in the sense of understanding how trauma occurs in our brain and what, for lack of a better word, pieces are missing. Because there are pieces missing. There are gaps in the growth and development of the brain. And so I'll get a little technical for a second. So Dan Siegel he has a hand model that he uses, and so this is our brain. And when we develop from in utero on, our brains develop from the bottom up and from the back to the front. And so this is where our brain stem is. So it's down here low in our neck area. And this is where, when we have child trauma, early childhood trauma, this is where kids kind of get stuck in this brainstem area. And this is our flight, fight, and freeze response. And so when you have a third grader who has a trauma history and they're triggered by something, doesn't matter what it is, they have some type of trigger, they go from their front of their brain, their cortex, right into their brainstem instantly. And so then they have a response. They have a flight, fight, or freeze response. And what happens if you're facing a bear in the wilderness? What happens when you're facing a shark in the ocean? You're going to have a brainstem response. And so every time a kiddo who has a trauma history has one of those triggers, they go right into their brainstem and behaviors happen. So for me, the geek in me, it's understanding all of that brain piece and how can I, for lack of a better word, regrow the brain.
It makes all the sense in the world. I mean, and like you're talking about, that's your brainstem, that's the primitive part of your brain, right? Like
they call it reptilian brain.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Like everything has it. Even a plant has, I mean, maybe they can't flight, I guess, but living things recognize when they're in danger or,
yep.
When something really good has happened, and there's a primitive response to that, as opposed to, I guess all the thinking happens back here, it sounds like, or the reasoning.
Thinking happens up here. Thinking happens
okay. I don't know how it works.
It's all good. And so for children who have trauma histories, everything is a trigger. And so they're always in here. They're always in flight, fight, or freeze. And so they are acting out, and they're showing you with their behaviors that they can't say with words what's going on for them. And so then the play comes in and meets them down here. This is early childhood, where we are still growing the brain into what we want it to be. And so play takes us back into that brainstem naturally, and gives kids the opportunity to start from the bottom up.
So do you think the internet is a way of people that don't have developed brains to react to things?
Oh, I have stories about the internet.
Sorry.
It's all good. I have a love-hate relationship with it.
Agreed. So you're a doctor. Are you a doctor? You're a therapist.
I am not a doctor. I have a master's degree in counseling.
Okay. So, but you're an educated, you've taken a lot of courses, you've got a lot of education. I'm sure you look at data all the time that says this is whatever, whatever the data represents. How are ways that you can take, because we all do that now. Data is like the thing now, right? We all go to work and we look at a bunch of data, we interpret the data, we do something with it. I work for a bank, and that's all we do. We look at the data with the money and where, et cetera. So how does that come into play with what you're doing? And, how do you use data and interpret data and I guess look at data, but separate that from caring for a child while they're playing and learning how to regrow those parts of their brain? How does it come into play in a positive way, and how do you keep it separate at the same time?
So on a global scale, there is constantly research being done in not only the brain development, but in play therapy. There are multiple universities that are training play therapists right off the bat. And most of those people are doing dissertations in play therapy and the efficacy of that. And so there's lots of research out that supports we call it evidence-based, you call it data, that supports the efficacy of using play therapy with children who have any kind of experiences. It doesn't have to be traumatic experiences. But any reason that you would take a child to therapy can be utilized in play therapy. when we then go into a more condensed version of that, as a clinician, I have to write treatment goals. Here are the goals that this child needs to accomplish, and here's how we're going to accomplish those goals. Most of the time, especially within the behavioral health system, you have to quantify that. You have to put a number. If the child has, temper tantrums, it's how many days a week? Okay, they have 6 out of 7 temper tantrums, and they last for an hour. There's your data. And so treatment goal is going to be, and here's how we define success, right? Our goal is to have 4 temper tantrums a week that only last 30 minutes. And so when we can get to that place, we have success because we've accomplished that goal. And so that's kind of the way, not only to support that play therapy works, but also to gather the data that we're being successful in what we're doing. Because a lot of people will say, you just play. And I tell parents this when I do intakes with them. When you say to your child, what did you do in therapy today? They're going to say to you, I played. And that's exactly what they did. So a lot of people will just say, all you do is play. Yep, that's exactly what I do. But I can show you the documentation and the success of what this play looks like through reduced behaviors, through increased communication, through all of these things. So that's where the data comes into play for me as a direct clinician.
Yeah, and dealing with kids that have dealt with trauma their whole lives, they may not have ever gotten to play before. It might be a fairly new thing for them.
Correct.
So I have a friend, and he and his wife had done, I think they were working on playground stuff, and they were looking at, now we've worked really hard to make our playgrounds safe. We got those foam ground we put in, and don't climb on this, everything's plastic or whatever. We were going up with gravel and rusty metal, right? So
Drinking out of the faucet hose.
And our parents had who knows what, I don't even know what that, they were walking uphill to school too. So one of the things he has talked to me about, though, is that if there is zero danger for a kid on a playground, they don't learn anything. Like how do you, is that something you look at, like, and not danger is not the right word, but
right.
Does there have to be a sense of maybe failure might be, is there had to be a sense of failure that would help that child learn how to deal with that failure, and that comes part of the cognition? Is that part of what you do as well?
Yeah, so our brains are experience expectant and they're experience dependent. They're waiting for experiences to happen in order for neuronal pathways to say, oh, that's what this means. So we tell children all the time, this is the best example I can give of this, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Eventually your child's going to touch the stove and they're going to burn themselves because it's hot, right? No matter how many, you've said it 100 times, don't touch the stove, it's hot. You've pushed them away, you've kept them out of the kitchen. Eventually they're going to touch the stove, and that little pathway in their brain goes, oh, that hurt. I don't want to do that again. So our brain is waiting for those experiences. If we don't have them, then how do we learn, don't do that? Or how do we learn, ooh, that felt good? Or how do we learn, I don't know how this feels, and I might need to do it again to figure this out. That's the way our brains work. That's the way every person's brain works. And so if we're not given rewards and consequences, I guess is the best way to kind of simplify that, then our brains don't have the opportunity to figure that out.
Can you give me an example of what you might do in a play session? Like, do you give kids instructions or guidelines or pathways, or how do you work with a kid in a session?
As far as just in general, or as far as what you just asked me regarding?
Well, so in general, do you just throw them in a room with a bunch of toys and observe them, or do you
Fun, see you
say,
later.
yeah, or do you say, here's the kitchen set, I need you to make me some eggs, and then see how they respond to that?
So there's two answers to there's multiple answers to your question, but if you ask different play therapists the same question, you're going to get different answers because of our theoretical approach. So there's many theories of play therapy, and many of them differ in the core of them might be the same, but they differ in how they do the actual therapy. So there's a group of therapists where play therapy originated was from a child-centered perspective. And so what that means is that the child will do the work that the child needs to do and how they're going to do it. And your job as a therapist is to hold up the mirror and say, this is what you're doing, and this is how this looks, and this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I'm observing. And you're just there to process that, be that window. It's and that theory is based on adult theories, a Carl Rogers theory of person-centered therapy. So a child-centered therapist is going to absolutely go into the room with the child and just follow the child's lead. The child gets to decide what they're going to do. The child gets to decide how it's going to look. The child gets to decide what they're going to play with. The child gets to name the objects. If the child picks this up and says, what's this? As a child-centered play therapist, I'm going to say, in here, it can be anything you want it to be. And they're going to tell me it's a rocket ship. And if I were to say it's a pen, they're going to say, oh, well, okay, I don't want to play with that then. So that's one, I'm super simplifying this, but that's one theory to how to approach play therapy. Other theories are so that's a non-directive approach. That's allowing the child to lead how that looks. Other theories are much more directive. And by that, it might mean that you have a planned activity. So a child might come into the session and as a therapist that they're dealing with self-esteem issues. And so you have a planned activity of something for them to do that's going to focus on increasing self-esteem, looking at self-esteem, assessing self-esteem. So that might look like I might ask a child to draw a picture of themselves. So it's a directed intervention that says, please do this. And then I give them the tools to do that. And I don't want to say assessing, but I'm assessing their drawing as they go. And what are they giving me with that drawing? A directive activity might look at, if we're talking about self-esteem, I might ask an older child that has more verbal expression to tell me what they see when they look in a mirror, draw a picture of that, write a story about that. And so I'm using more directive words to guide them to where I think they need to go. But that's my agenda, right? As the therapist, I'm directing that because that's my chosen theory when I think about children. And so there's a lot of different ways that can look. And so again, put 5 of us in here and you're going to get 5 different answers to how they engage a child in play.
What's the balance for you? So when you tell a kid to draw a self-portrait, right? And like you said, you're assessing them, but you're not assessing them. Where's the balance come where, because you are making assessments, mm-hmm. But if you're not in the moment with the child, then you could really interrupt what they're doing, or you could lose credibility with the kid, right? It's like, oh, this person's just here to watch me and take note. Like, you don't take a notepad in there. Do you take a notepad in there?
I don't, but others do. Okay. I mean, there's not a right or wrong. I don't choose to because I do find it disruptive and interruptive for kids. I also, especially if we're talking about art, I will doodle. I don't just sit there and like, oh, what are you doing? What are you drawing? Like I will, I'll doodle on a piece of paper. I used to draw. So whatever I would ask them to draw, I would draw. But I found that my drawing would influence their drawing. And I didn't want that, right? I want it to be their own brain work coming out, their own subconscious piece coming out. And so then I just started doodling. So I would doodle flowers, I would doodle suns, I would just doodle little things, so that they don't feel like they're being under a microscope and stared at. And why is this person just sitting here? Like, it's weird.
Yeah, you're not going to get that genuine response from them if you're hovering or you're helicoptering. Yeah, right. What are you doing?
Microscopic.
Yeah, I'm gonna do whatever makes you happy is what they're gonna do at that point, right? So what's the indicator for you that it's time for a kid to move on? Or will you see a kid from the time they're 3 till the time they're 18? Or how does that work with the time frames?
again, ask 5 of us that question, you'll probably get 5 different answers. Some therapists are much more short term. So a cognitive behavioral therapist, cognitive behavioral play therapist, has a behavior that they are trying to extinguish. And so it might take 6 sessions, it might take 10 sessions, it might take 20 sessions to extinguish that behavior. And that's their goal, is to extinguish that behavior. It's not the reason for the behavior, it's just the behavior itself. But a more, so my approach is an Adlerian play therapy approach. And so I typically don't prescribe a number of sessions. I let the child dictate where we go. And when parents are reporting to me, or guardians, case managers, whatever, are reporting to me changes in behaviors, they're sleeping better through the night, they're not acting out at school, they're not getting kicked out of their classes, we're seeing progress. And so a lot of times I let the team, so to speak, kind of drive that decision. It's not, for my kids, it's not short-term therapy. This is long-term therapy. This is, we may be in therapy for 6 months, a year. We may need to take a break for a while. They're going to come back at some point, because there's always going to be, not always, but there may very well be contributing factors that change as hormones change, as development hits, and they get triggered by things. They may need to come back into therapy. So it's always, again, as a clinician, I drive treatment by their treatment goals. And so when those treatment goals are accomplished, we either reassess for new goals or we are done with therapy.
Okay. I would imagine you mentioned that sometimes some therapists deal with extinguishing behavior. I'm assuming that's some kind of dangerous behavior at that, but that's not like...
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It could be, so let's say you have an anxious child, just generally no trauma, just an anxious child, and they bite their fingernails, and you want that behavior to stop. And you want the anxiety to decrease so the behavior stops, like it's that connection. And so the behavior to extinguish is the biting the fingernails, but we have to decrease the anxiety in order for the biting the fingernails to stop, which means we need different coping strategies. So when we talk about, I'm going to get technical again, when we talk about cognitive behavioral type of play therapy, we look at the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So the things leading up to the behavior itself, and then the consequence from that behavior. And so as a cognitive behavioral play therapist, that's the kind of dyad or triad that you're looking at. It's not necessarily the reasons why, the underlying behavior, underlying issues that affect the behavior. It's what's the trigger, what's the behavior, and then what's the outcome.
That makes sense.
Okay.
So how do you go about determining if that is really behavior that needs to be extinguished, or if it's just something that, people bite their nails, right? And what's the measuring stick, I guess, there?
And I'm, using that loosely as an example, but the measurement would be if this behavior is impacting daily life function. If this behavior is impacting their ability to do okay in school, if this behavior is impacting their ability to sleep at night, whatever. So it might, obviously biting the nails is not that big of a deal, but if it's making them sick because they're swallowing their fingernails, then that might be a behavior that we need to extinguish.
You guys spit those things out.
Or if they're biting their fingernails in class and they're spitting it on their neighbor,
well,
that might be a behavior we need to extinguish.
Not a great behavior there, I guess. What's something I'm missing? I kind of that's kind of run the gamut for me. From the things you triggered in me to ask questions about. But what is something in there that you see or about what you're doing that maybe I didn't ask about, or that you would want people to understand, to say, hey, this is the deal. So maybe they can help their own kids work through stuff.
So for me, I think the biggest piece is that play therapy works. I think that, how how do I say that? A lot of, there's lots and lots of therapists in this country that work with children, in this world that work with children. And I don't mean this the way it's going to probably come out. But if you're not doing play, what are you doing? If you've got a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old that is sitting in your office and you're trying to do traditional talk therapy, how are you defining success? How is that looking? So and take this for what it's worth. I am a bleeding heart play therapist. I believe wholeheartedly in what I do. And I question when people are working with children and don't use play. So I would encourage, if parents are listening to this, if other clinicians are listening to this, whoever's listening to this, ask the questions about play therapy. Find people who do know what they're talking about. Find people who are comfortable working with children. Again, I have taught at the university level in the counseling program, and I've encountered so many people who tell me they want to work with children, and I'm thinking to myself, you have no business working with kids. Like, you just don't.
How do you have that conversation with
That's
somebody?
judgmental of me, but
yeah, no. How do you have that? I mean, you've been doing this for 25 years. You probably got a good feel for whether somebody's going to be successful with kids or not. I mean, that's true of anybody that's been doing anything for that long. So have you had those conversations with people to say, hey, let's have a direct conversation. This is not going to be your bag. I mean, take a shot, but I mean, this is not exactly on our topic, but how do you have that conversation with somebody?
well, unfortunately, I'm really blunt. Sometimes it comes back to bite me in the butt, but I do try to be. I mean, I'm a therapist. I do try to be kind and gentle, and all those things. But the truth of the matter is, you gotta be honest. And so, it's having conversations with people and saying, this might not be the profession. This might not be your area of expertise. You are a great therapist. This might be something you need to look at a little closer. Or, it's a hard conversation to have. I've had them. It's a hard conversation to have. But again, I feel like I would be doing a disservice to others if I didn't have those conversations. Because if I wouldn't send my child to this person, then how is that okay?
Yeah, you're like the Simon Cowell of child therapy training.
Hopefully a little nicer. I freely admit I have high expectations. I have high standards, because I love what I do and because I'm passionate about what I do. I freely acknowledge that I have high standards when it comes to people working with children. And as a parent, you should too, right? Like, you should want somebody who knows what they're doing and understands child development and understands how best to work with your kid. And it shouldn't just be, and I say that, I hate that word, but it shouldn't just be they're the first available appointment that you get. You wouldn't settle for that for yourself. If you needed a heart transplant or some kind of major medical issue, you wouldn't settle for the first available doctor. You would research it. You would find who's got a specialty in this area and who's got this. And so you would do that for yourself. I would encourage anybody listening to this to do that for your child too.
That's great. Well, Juliet, I mean, this is educational for me. I've learned a lot just in here talking to you. I can tell you're passionate about doing this. If that comes through, like that takes no effort. It just comes right off of you that this is something you really feel strongly about. So
I do. I love what I do. Can I just add one more piece? If there is anybody listening that wants to know more about play therapy, wants to find a play therapist in their area, I am a credentialed play therapist. We have a national board that credentials us, and that is the Association for Play Therapy. And so you can go directly to their website, the4pt.org, and you can find, there are thousands of us all across the country. You can find somebody in your, hopefully, depending on how rural you are, find a therapist in your area that practices play therapy.
So first, it's the National Association of Play Therapists. Is that what you said?
Association for Play Therapy.
National Association for Play Therapy. So you can probably Google that.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to go directly to the website, it's
the number 4, pt.org.
like physical, like play therapy. Yeah, there you go.
So it's Association for Play Therapy. So it's the number 4, pt.org.
That's great. It's always interesting to see, people bought up these web names back when it first started. So now you got to get creative with it. A4pt.org. That's great.
Huh?
Juliet Fortino, thank you. This has been an education, and I really appreciate your time. And it's really good to see somebody who's passionate about helping kids. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So thanks for everything you're doing.
I appreciate you letting me talk about it because I do love to talk about it.
Well, perfect. Maybe we'll talk more down the road.
Okay, happy to.
All right. Thanks, Juliet.
Thanks, Dirk.